Today, President Obama held a joint news conference at the White House with British Prime Minister David Cameron and pledged a united effort to fight terrorism in the wake of the Paris attacks. I want you to listen very closely to both leaders. One identifies the terror threat we face by name. The other one, not so much.
We do face a very serious Islamist extremist terrorist threat in Europe, in America, across the world. And we have to be incredibly vigilant in terms of that threat.
This phenomenon of violent extremism, I do not consider it an existential threat. This is a problem that causes great heartache and tragedy and destruction, but it is one that ultimately we're going to defeat.
And the president also issued a plea to Europe to not respond harshly following one of the worst terror attacks on its soil.
Our biggest advantage, Major, is that our Muslim populations, they feel themselves to be Americans. There are parts of Europe in which that's not the case. And that's probably the greatest danger that Europe faces. It's important for Europe not to simply respond with a hammer and law enforcement and military approaches to these problems.
All right, let's start with that one. We'll get back to the whether or not who called them Islamic extremists and who didn't. Bob, President Obama right there just said don't respond with the hammer, recommending Europe not responding with the hammer. I'm shaking my head. Couldn't believe he said that.
Well, I mean, it is a caution for these countries that have huge Muslim populations that you don't want to have, and you don't want to just divide that community and force them to make a decision on which side they're going to be on. And that's the thing that worries me about this. These people are making headway to a point, and now it's sort of stalled here. If they get more aggressive, what are they going to do? If they have the cells, they should arrest them.
I'm trying to figure out what headway they're making. They just had 17 people killed on their soil.
Well, and how many have been saved?
Well, I don't know. We don't know.
Either,
but we do know there's a massive attack that they probably, well, they may have had information to stop, to thwart, that they couldn't and they didn't. Dana, would you recommend the president make that analogy, don't use a hammer?
Not necessarily. No, that was not necessarily the words I would have used. I think what he was also trying to say was to say to Europe, we've done a better job in America of assimilating our Muslims. You need to do a better job of that. And I'm not so sure that's the case. I mean, on the scale of it, on the numbers are very different. The number of Muslim Americans is much lower percentage-wise than in France. Also, France and the rest of Europe, they have oodles of programs and outreach and ways to try to assimilate. And, assimilation is also a choice. It's not that the French people haven't tried. I think that they have. I think that the immigrants have decided that they wanted to remain kind of close in their communities. Maybe that's where the gap is. But I think that the president was a little too harsh on Europe there.
Too harsh on them,
suggesting that they I think he was too harsh, suggesting that Europe has not done enough to assimilate, because I think assimilation is also a choice.
Be more like America. Look to America and assimilate the way we do. I don't know. It feels no.
No, I'm saying that the Muslim populations are making a choice.
Okay, I got you, Greg. It feels to me like he's just too soft on terror.
Well, you shouldn't accuse Europe of responding to this with a tool, because they're not the ones running around with axes. And he's saying that Europe has to do better to assimilate them, but if they don't want to be assimilated, it's pointless, and it avoids the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is a cowardice of the establishment in confronting this danger, because they have this huge fear of upsetting the radicals. And they're worried about this idea of a backlash. Meanwhile, in Niger, Muslims burned down Christian churches and shops run by Christians. A real backlash that you don't hear about because it doesn't fit into the assumptions of the media. The backlash is supposed to be us against them, but it's not. It's always them against us. And until you actually admit that, maybe President Obama should talk to Bill Ayers and consult the mindset of a terrorist and find out what makes them tick.
See, and Andrew, if he said, listen, you shouldn't use a hammer or Europe, I would be okay with it, as long as he came back with you should be bulldozing these people into oblivion where they came from. I'm shocked that he stood up there with another European leader and just showed the difference between the two. You want to talk about that, or you want to talk about the fact that Cameron said Islamist, extremist terrorists, and Obama said violent extremists?
I don't want to get caught up in the rhetoric, but I would say this. I mean, President Obama said they shouldn't use a hammer. I agree with that. They should use an AK-47. Right. The problem is David Cameron and others, and the leaders that have come before him, have turned the cheek because of political correctness. Now, it is a bit different than the United States, what's happening in France and Germany and Belgium. I mean, a lot of these countries in northern Africa that are seeing the rise of Islamists were former colonies, and they immigrated. They asked these countries to send workers to come into the society and work there. And they haven't become assimilated. They haven't, and that's been a choice. They've decided not to do that. But they're also getting checks from a very socialist government. They have dual passports. They can go back and forth. So they're not working with unemployment in France above 22% for young people. So they're ripe for radicalization. The problem is they can say whatever they want. Radical Islamists. We've had this debate for weeks now.
Right.
It's the policies, Eric, and the immigration policies in the UK and in France. Until Cameron and others have the guts to do something policy-wise, they're not going to fix this problem. It's only going to get worse. And another thing, David Cameron, this was a big campaign commercial for him today. He's up for re-election. So unlike President Obama, the reason he had harsher rhetoric, Eric, is because he knows people in England want to hear those words. Right. That's why he went through this laundry list of global poverty, inequality, climate change, getting the Spice Girls back together, bringing Beckham back, finding a wife for Prince Harry. I mean, what else did David Cameron tout himself doing today? Everything.
Let me ask you a question, Eric. You said, do it the way we do it here. We don't do it very well at all. Look at New York City.
I said assimilation is what I was talking
President
about.
Obama was saying that we do it well.
President Obama was saying that, but look at how we do it.
Do we not agree that the Muslims are concentrated in one neighborhood? We know that's true about virtually every post-World War II immigration movement into this country have assimilated not been assimilated. They've lived in the same area. They live with each other. That's where they feel comfortable.
Well, listen, I'm not saying we're doing it right. I'm saying President Obama was.
He said we did it right.
Saying we do it right here, Europe, before you go ahead and drop the hammer.
I don't think
work on assimilation.
But the reason why he said that is because so far the response to terror has been a reactive one because it's his priorities are not in order. He spends more time demonizing a pipeline than pipe bombs. So when you ask about this, he has to downplay it as though we're always kind of getting around to terror on the list of things we got to get to. But there's the environment, there's climate change, there's all this other stuff ahead.
This is a great transition from the next soundbite we want you to hear. President Obama, he addressed the negotiations with Iran with a warning, not to Iran, to Congress.
Why is it that we would have to take actions that might jeopardize the possibility of getting a deal over the next 60 to 90 days? If this diplomatic solution fails, then the risks and likelihood that this ends up being at some point a military confrontation is heightened. I will veto a bill that comes to my desk. We'll see how persuasive I am, but if I'm not persuading Congress, I promise you I'm going to be taking my case to the American people on this.
You just nailed that. You said he's got his priorities. He spends too much time demonizing the wrong people. He's demonizing the American people in Congress rather than the bad guys, Iran.
Yeah, and it's always, for him, it's never, I love the strategy with this, it's never a partisan issue when he's making a point. But when you disagree with him, it's always a partisan issue. I think the problem for a lot of us is that we don't trust him as a negotiator. It's like when you hear him talking about Iran, it's like you're watching the opposite of the World Series of Poker, where you see the world's worst player get his clock cleaned by casual players that have been doing this for a while, and you think he's going to give away everything, including the White House.
Thoughts on this one, Ange?
I think what Greg just said is really important. What is he going to give away? What is he giving away? And I'm wondering if he's willing to sacrifice his entire Middle East strategy by perhaps working with Iran. Like, I'm wondering if there's a deal that's been done. And I only ask that because we've talked on this network about the times that the White House has reached out written letters to Iran. I'm wondering if he's trying to cut a deal with Iran to try and defeat ISIS, because he needs their help. Either he doesn't know how to do it, he doesn't want to do it, and so he's willing to sacrifice the security or some kind of deal with them by taking concessions off the table for something bigger. I just don't understand, Eric, what the incentive would be for Iran now. They're running out the clock, they're taking a knee, and they're just saying, he doesn't have the wherewithal to stop us. So
We'll
we'll take advantage of them.
Can we do one thing? Can I just add? You, at this table for the last 2.5 years, have said that these sanctions against Iran were working. Obama pulled the sanctions and now says he's going to warn that he will veto any legislation that would put the sanctions
some
back
of the
in place.
sanctions, and we don't know whether this negotiations are going to work out or not. But why not try? You want to just launch planes and go and bomb it right now? I mean, if we want to do that, we're going to yeah, I understand that. We don't know. We don't know what the details of these negotiations are. And we don't know whether the sanctions are having some effect. We certainly know the sanctions he put on Russia.
Yourself, Bob, over the years have said these sanctions are having a massive effect on the Iranian economy.
I'd never used the word massive. I said it's having an impact.
All right. Dana, President Obama vetoing a bill that came to his desk of putting sanctions back in place. Good idea or bad idea?
Well, I think in his mind or in his foreign policy plan that any deal is better than no deal. And the best deal for him is the one that kicks this problem down the road for 2 years and the next president has to deal with it. But then he went on to say, I will veto it, and then you can bet that I'm going to take my case to the American people. In which case, what Bob just said, I think, becomes a communications challenge. On the one hand, we are telling the Russians that we are going to do more sanctions because we think they are effective. On the other hand, we're saying to Iran, we're going to withdraw, we're going to not have as many sanctions, maybe give you a little bit of a break because we think that's effective. Now, in the world of foreign policy, where it's murky, that all makes sense. But if you try to take that case to the American people, I think it gets a little bit more difficult.
Speaking of taking the case to the American people, Tuesday night, State of the Union address, President Obama, we heard maybe a preview of that today, maybe not. Dana, what do you expect for Tuesday?
Not much, given that the White House Communications Office talked to Politico in the last couple of days and basically said, yeah, we're not really going to do that whole State of the Union thing again. We're not going to try to lay out a big plan. You know, he's already sort of said all the things he's going to do. He's just going to use it as a messaging event. So tune in. That's going to be great.
And your thoughts on State of the Union?
I don't know what he's going to say because I think he already knows what he wants to do. He's just not going to be able to stand up and say, I don't care what any of you people think in the room. I don't care about the Constitution. I don't care how you vote or what you pass. I'm going to use my pen and I'm going to veto it. I'll see you in court if you don't like it. He's going to figure out some fluffy way to talk about the same stuff we've heard him talk about at every other State of the Union.
Let's keep in mind he has only vetoed 2 bills the 6 years he's been in.
But why?
Right, why?
Why?
Because he doesn't
Harry
get them.
Reid didn't send him any bills.
He doesn't have any bills to veto.
I think what he's going to do, can I make the part here for a second? Says I think he's going to try to find 1 or 2 pieces of legislation they can agree on. I think you're going to hear more about working together than you're going to hear about on trade. I've said this before, trade and tax and maybe immigration.
Immigration. Yeah, I can see it. Greg, your thoughts on State of the Union?
It would be refreshing if he said, State of the Union, it's bad. That would be great. And then he should talk about union, the idea of what is this country actually unified? We can talk about all these issues, but the fact is there's a sense of division and unhappiness in this country that he is terrified of approaching. And he says he's going to spend the next 2 years on the offensive. Mm-hmm. And I hope that's for America, not toward America.
Very good, very good.
Also, quickly, he's reaching out to the creators of YouTube to try and reach millennials with this speech, which is some of them are doing ads on push-up bras and silly things like that. So it's almost like, and Greg, you've talked about this before, he's going where he's perceived to be well-liked. He says, forget all the adults. The kids still like me, so I'll target my speech to community colleges and kids.
I will guarantee you, I'm not sure what he's going to say, but I'll guarantee you 2 things that will be in that speech tomorrow night. It's the unemployment rate and the price of gasoline, because he's going to take credit for both. And there's those of us who think that he has nothing to do with any of the numbers that are positive on those. I'm sorry, on Tuesday night on State of the Union. We're going to leave it right there.